Honestly, I'm just so literally exhausted by people acting like they own the world, which I guess is the whole reason sovereign ruling even exists. I mean, you're about to see how a little bit of contract law and like Chuck's nasty chewing tobacco habit turned into a massive headache for the worst kind of tourists. Let's just jump right into this absolute mess. I was standing on my front porch in my plaid boxers, clutching a mug of black coffee like it was a life preserver, watching a 3-ton tragedy unfold. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The sun was just barely peeking over the Smoky Mountains, casting a beautiful, serene golden glow over Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And right in the middle of that pristine morning glow was a lifted, neon green Ford F-250 currently entirely occupying my property. The truck was so massive it practically had its own zip code. The driver, a guy wearing wraparound sunglasses even though it was barely daylight, was locked in a desperate, sweaty battle with his steering wheel. He threw it into reverse. Crunch. That was my mailbox. He threw it into drive. Snap. There went the edging around my wife's prized petunia bed. "Hey!" I yelled, nearly spilling scalding coffee down my bare chest. "Hey, what are you doing?" The guy didn't even roll down his window. He just gave me this lazy, dismissive half-wave, the kind of wave you give a waiter when you don't need water anymore. He cranked the wheel again, the massive tires tearing deep, muddy trenches into the soft earth at the edge of my asphalt. "Do I look like a roundabout to you?" I screamed, taking a step down the porch stairs, the crisp mountain air suddenly feeling a lot less refreshing. He finally rolled down the passenger side window just enough to let out a cloud of cheap vape smoke. "Relax, buddy," he hollered over the roar of his diesel engine. "I missed the turn for the pancake cabin, just turning around." "You're in my yard." "It's just a driveway, man. Chill out," he yelled back, slamming the truck into gear and peeling out, leaving a thick black skid mark across my concrete and a cloud of exhaust that settled right over my porch. I stood there, vibrating with rage, staring at the decimated petunias and the mailbox that was now leaning at a pathetic 45-degree angle. This was my life now. When I bought this house just off the main parkway in Gatlinburg, I thought I was getting a peaceful mountain retreat. I didn't realize I was buying real estate at the dead end of a geographical funnel. Gatlinburg is a tourist trap. It's a beautiful, chaotic, pancake-obsessed nightmare of narrow, winding roads. GPS signals bounce off the mountains, confusing every minivan from Ohio and every rental SUV from Florida. And right where the GPS usually cuts out, there is a sharp left turn. If you miss that turn, the road narrows, the shoulder disappears, and suddenly the only flat, paved surface for a quarter mile is my driveway. It wasn't just an occasional nuisance. It was a relentless, daily invasion. By noon that same day, I had logged 4 more turnarounds, a Subaru Outback that nearly took off my side mirror, a lost delivery truck that left a streak of rust on my retaining wall, a pack of incredibly loud motorcycles that revved their engines so hard my windows rattled. But the breaking point? The absolute unquestionable last straw? That happened at 4:30 p.m. I was in the living room trying to get some work done when I heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel. I looked out the window. A silver Dodge Grand Caravan was parked dead center in my driveway. Not turning around. Parked. I watched in disbelief as the side door slid open. A woman in a floral sundress hopped out, completely ignoring my house, and started ushering 3 small children toward the massive ancient oak tree at the edge of my property line. No, I thought. No, they wouldn't. They would. I threw open the front door and marched outside, not even bothering to put on shoes. "Excuse me," I shouted. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The woman spun around, looking mildly annoyed that I had interrupted her. "Oh, we just need a quick pit stop. They couldn't hold it until we got to the Ripley's aquarium." "This is my front yard," I yelled, pointing to the obvious house attached to the obvious driveway. "You can't just pull over and use my oak tree as a public restroom." "Well, there's nowhere else to pull over," she shot back, completely unbothered, her hands on her hips. "You don't need to be so rude about it. It's just a tree. It's private property. Get back in your van and leave." She scoffed, a loud, dramatic noise, and ushered her kids back into the van, muttering loudly about Southern hospitality being a myth. She slammed the door, threw it in reverse, and nearly backed over my garbage cans on her way out. I stood in the driveway, barefoot on the cold asphalt, staring at the damp spot near the base of my tree. The rage wasn't just hot anymore. It was crystallizing. It was turning into something sharp and focused. Politeness was off the table. Yelling from the porch was ineffective. I needed a solution. The next morning, I drove down to the local hardware store. I walked straight past the tools, past the paint, and headed right for the aisle with the high-visibility signs. I bought 5 of them. Big, obnoxious, bright orange plastic signs that read, "Private driveway. No turnarounds. Violators will be prosecuted." I felt a surge of smug satisfaction as I hammered them into the ground. 1 by the mailbox, 1 by the tree, 2 lining the entrance. I even zip-tied 1 to a metal stake right in the center of the asphalt. "That ought to do it," I muttered, brushing the dirt off my hands. "They ain't gonna read that, kid." I jumped and spun around. My neighbor, Dave, was leaning over our shared chain-link fence. Dave is a retired mechanic who spends 90% of his day smoking cheap cigars and watching the world burn from his front porch. He was wearing a faded NASCAR t-shirt and shaking his head. "What do you mean?" I asked, gesturing proudly to my bright orange fortress. "It's literally right in their face." "Tourists can't read," Dave stated, taking a slow drag of his cigar. "They go blind the second they cross the county line. They only see what they want to see. And what they want to see is a place to turn their stupid rented Jeeps around." "They're bright orange, Dave," I argued. "You'd have to be blind to miss them." Dave just chuckled. A dry, raspy sound. "I give it 3 hours." He was wrong. It only took 2. I was sitting at my kitchen island eating a sandwich when I saw a white Mercedes SUV confidently swing into the driveway. The driver didn't even tap the brakes. He drove right over the center sign, the plastic snapping with a loud crack that echoed off the mountains. He executed a flawless 3-point turn, crushing one of the side signs in the process, and casually drove away. I walked outside and picked up the shattered, tire tread-covered pieces of my bright orange plastic defense system. Dave coughed from his porch next door. "Told you." I threw the plastic shards into the garbage can. Dave was right. Signs that asked for compliance were useless. Signs that threatened vague legal action like prosecution were a joke, because the local cops didn't care about a minor trespassing call on a busy tourist weekend. If I called the Gatlinburg police to report a turnaround, they'd laugh me off the phone. If I confronted them, I was the bad guy. If I put up signs, they became speed bumps. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down at my laptop. I stared at the blinking cursor on a blank search engine page. I cracked my knuckles. "How do you stop people from using your driveway? Can you get a car towed if they are in the car? Is it legal to put a spike strip on your own property?" Quick answer, absolutely not. Highly illegal, do not do this. I spiraled down a rabbit hole of property rights, trespassing statutes, and municipal codes. And then, at around 2 a.m., my eyes burning and my 3rd cup of coffee completely cold, I stumbled across a thread on a legal forum discussing parking garage disputes. A user was complaining about getting a massive bill from a private parking lot because they drove in, couldn't find a spot, and drove out 3 minutes later. The lot's automated cameras had caught their license plate. The legal justification? A massive, highly visible sign at the entrance that laid out a contract. By entering this facility, you agree to pay the posted fees. Acceptance of this contract is established by conduct, driving past this sign. I sat up straight in my chair. My driveway wasn't a driveway. I opened a new document and started typing furiously. I didn't want to fine these people. Fines are punitive. Only the government can issue a fine. But a business? A business can charge whatever it wants for a service. If someone wanted to use my pristine, highly convenient, perfectly paved stretch of asphalt to correct their navigational failures, they absolutely could. But it was no longer free. It was a premium vehicular maneuvering zone. I didn't need a no turnaround sign. I needed a menu. I spent the next 48 hours drowning in paperwork. I drove down to the county clerk's office in downtown Gatlinburg. The clerk, a lovely woman named Brenda, whose reading glasses hung from a sparkly chain around her neck, looked incredibly confused as I slid the forms across her desk. "You want to register a DBA for Mountain View Premium Access LLC?" Brenda asked, squinting at the paperwork. "What kind of business is this exactly?" "It's a private toll facility," I said, keeping a perfectly straight face. "A premium vehicular maneuvering zone for exclusive clientele." Brenda looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Honey, your address is residential." "It's a commercial overlay based on usage," I countered smoothly, having memorized exactly 3 sentences of zoning jargon for this exact interaction. "I am monetizing a highly trafficked private asset," she stamped the paper. "Whatever you say, sweetheart. That'll be $50. I walked out of that office with a legitimate business license. I was officially the CEO of the most expensive stretch of asphalt in Sevier County. But a business license was just a piece of paper. To make this unilateral contract legally binding, to make it a true, undeniable, airtight trap, the signage had to be flawless. It couldn't be a flimsy piece of plastic from the hardware store. It had to be undeniable. It had to be DOT compliant, hyper-visible, and explicitly clear. And most importantly, I needed undeniable proof of acceptance by conduct. I needed license plates, timestamps, and high-definition footage. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I found on a flyer tacked to the bulletin board at the local diner. It was time to call Chuck. Chuck pulled into my driveway less than an hour after I called him. And honestly, the man was exactly what I needed. He drove a beat-up Chevy Silverado that looked like it had survived a minor war, and the bed was overflowing with PVC pipes, tangled coils of heavy-gauge wire, and unidentifiable rusted metal brackets. Chuck himself was a mountain of a man in faded Carhartt overalls, sporting a beard that looked like it housed a family of small birds, and he was aggressively chewing a wad of tobacco that distorted the entire left side of his face. He put the truck in park, leaving the diesel engine rumbling loudly, and stepped out onto my asphalt. He didn't say hello. He just looked at my leaning mailbox, looked at the tire tracks carved into my grass, and then looked at me standing on the porch. "You got a tourist problem," Chuck grunted, spitting a stream of dark brown juice into the rhododendron bush. "I literally have an invasion on my hands, Chuck," I said, walking down to meet him. "And I need to build a fortress, but like a legal, highly profitable fortress." Chuck crossed his massive arms. "I build decks, kid. I wire up hot tubs. I don't build fortresses. What exactly are you asking for?" I pulled a rolled-up piece of graph paper out of my back pocket and unrolled it across the hood of his truck. I had spent the last 3 hours sketching out a schematic that looked less like a residential driveway improvement and more like the security checkpoint for a supervillain's secret lair. "I need a commercial-grade license plate reader system," I explained, pointing to the diagrams I'd frantically drawn with a Sharpie. I'm talking high-definition, infrared night vision, weatherproof cameras. One angled to catch the front plate as they enter, one angled to catch the rear plate as they leave. I need them hardwired directly into my router inside the house because I am not relying on Wi-Fi for this, and I need a sign. A massive Department of Transportation compliant, diamond-grade reflective sign mounted on a steel pole, sunk deep into concrete. Chuck leaned over the paper, his eyes narrowing. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the idle of his truck and the distant roar of a Harley-Davidson navigating the parkway. You want me to wire a high-def camera system to catch license plates on a residential driveway? He asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. It's not a residential driveway anymore, I corrected him, tapping the LLC paperwork I had tucked under my arm. As of this morning, this is Mountain View Premium Access LLC. It is a commercial toll facility, and I guess I need to make sure my customers are properly documented when they use my services. Chuck looked at me, then looked at the paper, and then looked back at me. A slow, incredibly cynical grin spread across his face, revealing a row of tobacco-stained teeth. You're gonna charge the tourists for turning around, he stated, less of a question and more of a realization of pure awe. $200 a pop, I confirmed. I mean, it's a premium service, Chuck. Convenience comes at a price. He let out a bark of laughter that sounded like a tractor engine turning over. He spit another stream into the bushes. Son, you are crazy. I mean, genuinely unhinged. I like it, but this ain't gonna be cheap. Digging a trench for the Cat 6 cables, pouring the concrete footing for a commercial signpost, the cameras themselves. You're looking at a $3,000 minimum, maybe 4, depending on how thick the clay is under this grass. I don't care, I said without hesitation. Honestly, with the volume of traffic I get, this thing will pay for itself in a weekend. Can you do it? Chuck pulled a worn leather notepad out of his chest pocket and clicked a greasy pen. I'll have my supplier overnight the LPR cameras. I can get the steel pole and the concrete today. You get the sign made. We start digging tomorrow at 8 a.m. Don't be late. As Chuck rumbled away, leaving a faint cloud of diesel smoke, I went straight back into the house and fired up my laptop. I had to design the sign, and it had to be legally bulletproof. This couldn't be some flimsy, keep out warning. In the eyes of contract law, specifically regarding unilateral contracts and acceptance by conduct, the terms of the agreement had to be conspicuous, unambiguous, and impossible to misinterpret. If someone is going to enter into a contract with you just by driving onto your property, they have to be fully aware of the terms before they cross the threshold. I found a commercial traffic sign manufacturer online that usually supplied municipalities and construction companies. I selected their largest custom template, 48 inches by 36 inches. That's 4 feet wide by 3 feet tall. It was practically a billboard. I chose a bright, aggressive, DOT-approved, warning yellow background with bold black block lettering. I spent 2 hours drafting, deleting, and redrafting the text until it was a masterpiece of malicious compliance. It read, Notice of Toll Road Private Commercial Property, Mountain View, Premium Access LLC Unauthorized Turnaround or Entry Fee. $200 by passing this sign. You expressly consent to these terms and agree to pay the invoiced amount. Property monitored by LPR cameras. Violators will be billed in accordance with state civil law. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It cost me $400 to have it rushed printed on heavy-gauge aluminum with diamond-grade reflectiveness, meaning if headlights hit this thing at night, it would practically glow like a supernova. The next morning, promptly at 8 a.m., my front yard turned into a construction zone. Chuck arrived with a teenager named Cody, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. They brought a rented trench digger that tore a deep, jagged scar through my already ruined lawn, running from the edge of the driveway straight to the side of my house. My neighbor Dave wandered over around 10 a.m., holding a mug of coffee and wearing a pair of incredibly worn-out slippers. He stood by the fence, watching Cody struggle to wrestle a heavy PVC pipe into the freshly dug trench. "So," Dave drawled, taking a sip of his coffee, "you're actually doing it. You're building a toll booth." "Not a booth, Dave," I said, leaning on a shovel I wasn't really using. "An automated premium access gateway." Dave snorted. "You really think people are going to pay you? These people don't even pay attention to yield signs. You think they care about a fancy piece of metal?" "They will when the invoice shows up at their house," I said. "How you going to even find their address?" Dave asked, raising an eyebrow. "You ain't the cops." "I am a registered business with a legitimate need to collect on unpaid debts," I explained, lowering my voice so Chuck's trench digger wouldn't drown me out. "I spent last night registering my LLC for a commercial skip tracing software account. It's what repo men and private investigators use. As long as I have a legitimate business license and a clear photo of the plate, I pay $2.50 per search, and it pulls the registered owner's mailing address directly from the public records databases. It's totally legal, as long as I have the paperwork to back up the debt. And the camera footage is the paperwork." Dave just stared at me for a second, a look of genuine, low-key shock on his wrinkled face. "You are a very petty man," he finally said. "I am a businessman, Dave," I corrected him. By Friday afternoon, the installation was complete. It was a sight to behold. The steel pole was sunk 3 feet into solid concrete right at the property line, completely unavoidable. Mounted on it was the massive, glowing yellow sign. It was so big it looked like it belonged on an interstate off-ramp, not a residential street. Above the sign, Chuck had mounted the 2 heavy-duty LPR cameras. They were matte black, sleek, and had these ominous rings of infrared LEDs around the lenses. But Chuck's true masterpiece was the strobe. "I wired a motion-triggered relay," Chuck explained, wiping grease off his hands with a rag as we stood in the driveway admiring his work. "When a vehicle crosses the threshold, the camera software detects the plate, snaps the high-res photo, and triggers this LED strobe light. Just a quick double flash. It's exactly what the red light cameras use in the city. Lets them know they've been caught." "Chuck," I said, a tear of joy genuinely forming in my eye. "You are an artist. Just pay the invoice, kid," he grunted. I went inside, booted up my computer, and opened the proprietary software Chuck had installed. I configured the detection zones, drawing a virtual tripwire right across the entrance of the driveway, just behind the sign. I linked the system to my external hard drive. I took a deep breath, hovered my mouse over the screen, and clicked the button that said Arm System. The virtual light on the screen turned green. The trap was set. It was 4 p.m. on a Friday. The Gatlinburg weekend tourist rush was just beginning. The parkway would be backing up, the GPS systems would be getting confused, and people would be looking for an escape route. I went to the fridge, grabbed 2 cold beers, and walked out to the back porch. I called Dave over. "Get in here," I yelled over the fence. "It's showtime." Dave ambled over, took a beer, and we dragged 2 dining room chairs into my living room, parking them right in front of the massive 65-inch television where I had cast the camera software interface. It was like we were setting up to watch the Super Bowl. The screen showed a crystal-clear, high-definition view of my driveway, the massive yellow sign dominating the foreground. We didn't have to wait long. At exactly 4:17 p.m., a black Honda Odyssey with Florida plates came creeping up the narrow road. We watched on the screen as it hesitated. The driver hit the brakes. They were clearly lost. "Here we go," Dave whispered, leaning forward in his chair. The Odyssey slowly turned its wheels toward my driveway. It inched forward. The nose of the van crept right up to the sign. You could literally see the driver leaning over the steering wheel, squinting to read the massive block letters. "Read it," I muttered to the screen. "It says $200. Do the math, buddy." The driver paused for a full 10 seconds. I knew exactly what was going through his head. He was thinking, "This has to be a joke. It's just a driveway. Nobody actually charges for this." He took his foot off the brake. The Odyssey rolled past the sign. Flash! Even in the broad daylight, the double burst of the LED strobe was aggressive. It lit up the windshield of the van. The driver visibly jumped, slamming on the brakes halfway into my driveway. On the computer monitor, a little notification popped up with a satisfying ding. Event logged. FL plate, number XYZ's 123. Confidence, 99%. A perfectly cropped, high-resolution image of the license plate appeared on the screen, followed by a wide-angle shot of the van clearly passing the sign, with the timestamp plastered across the bottom corner. "Got him!" I cheered, raising my beer. Dave burst out laughing, slapping his knee. "He actually flinched! Did you see him jump?" The driver of the Odyssey was panicked now. He threw the van into reverse and backed out so fast he nearly put it into the ditch across the street, burning rubber as he sped away toward the parkway. "That," I said, taking a victorious sip of my beer, "was $200. "It's beautiful," Dave admitted, his cynicism entirely gone. "It's like fishing, but you don't even have to bait the hook." Over the next 4 hours, it was absolute chaos. It was like a psychological study in human entitlement. Car after car approached. About 50% of them would pull up, read the massive yellow sign, panic, and awkwardly reverse back down the street, respecting the contract. But the other 50%? The other 50% were pure gold. We watched a guy in a rented convertible Ford Mustang drive right past the sign, get flashed by the strobe, and then actually have the audacity to park, get out of his car, and walk up to inspect the camera. Ding! The system logged his plate. Ding! It logged his face looking directly into the lens. "That's bold," Dave noted. "He's inspecting the trap while he's caught in it." We watched a convoy of 3 lifted Jeeps follow each other right past the sign in rapid succession. Flash, flash, ding, flash, flash, ding, flash, flash, ding. $600 in 10 seconds, I calculated aloud, feeling like a casino owner watching the slot machines pay out. By 10 p.m., when the traffic finally died down, the system had logged 42 unauthorized entries, 42 high-definition photos of license plates, all completely clear, all time-stamped, all documenting the exact moment they drove past a sign that explicitly stated they were agreeing to pay $200. That was $8,400 in potential invoices. In one night. I barely slept. I woke up at 6 a.m. on Saturday, made a pot of coffee, and went straight to my computer. It was time to process the catch. I opened the commercial skip tracing software I had subscribed to under my LLC. The interface was utilitarian and stark. It felt like I was hacking the mainframe, but it was perfectly legal access granted to commercial entities for debt collection. I took the first plate number, the Florida Odyssey, and punched it into the search bar. I paid the $2.50 search fee. 3 seconds later, the screen populated. It gave me the registered owner's name, a guy named Gary, and his primary mailing address in Tampa, Florida. "Hello, Gary," I whispered to the screen. I opened up Microsoft Word. I had spent days agonizing over the formatting of the invoice. It couldn't look like a scam, and it couldn't look like a police ticket. It had to look like a hyper-professional, legally terrifying corporate document. I used a heavy, formal font. I put the Mountain View Premium Access LLC logo, a very official-looking mountain peak I bought on a stock image site for $5. At the top, I typed out the details with surgical precision. Invoice, Nard 10, 01. Date of service. Inserted date. Time of service. Inserted time. Vehicle license plate. FLXYZ 123. Service rendered. Premium vehicular maneuvering and turnaround access. Amount due, $200. Below the billing details, I included the high-resolution photo of the van passing the sign and a cropped, zoomed-in photo of the license plate. Then came the legal jargon, the part I was most proud of. Terms of contract. Please be advised that by driving past the conspicuously posted commercial signage at the entrance of this facility, you entered into a binding unilateral contract by acceptance of conduct. The signage clearly states the $200 fee for unauthorized turnaround or entry. As you utilized the private property for this purpose, you are legally obligated to remit payment for services rendered under the legal doctrine of quantum meruit and express contractual agreement. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in late fees, reporting to credit bureaus, and potential civil litigation for breach of contract, which may include additional legal fees and court costs. It was brutal. It was unyielding. It was completely, legally accurate. I hit print, my heavy-duty laser printer whirred to life, spitting out the invoice on thick, high-quality 24-pound linen paper. I wanted it to feel substantial when they opened the envelope. I wanted them to feel the weight of their own consequences. I spent the next 6 hours doing data entry. Look up the plate, pay the $2.50, copy the address, generate the invoice, print, fold, stuff into a heavy-duty business envelope, stamp, repeat. It was tedious work. But every time I sealed an envelope, I felt a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. I was finally fighting back. I wasn't just yelling from my porch anymore. I was weaponizing the bureaucracy of the legal system against the very people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. By mid-afternoon, I had a stack of 42 thick white envelopes sitting on my kitchen counter. They represented over $8,000 in billed services. Dave walked in through the unlocked back door, helping himself to my fridge. He popped the top on a soda and leaned against the counter, eyeing the massive stack of mail. "You actually did it," Dave said, sounding mildly impressed. "You wrote 'em all up." "Every single one," I said, tapping the stack. "I'm dropping them off at the post office before they close today." "You know they're gonna freak out, right?" Dave said, taking a sip. "People don't like getting bills they ain't expecting. Especially not for $200 just for turning a steering wheel." "That's the beauty of it, Dave," I replied, grabbing my keys. "I want them to freak out. I want them to call their lawyers. I want them to realize that they actually, legally, owe me this money. Because ignorance of a massive, glowing yellow contract is not an excuse to break it." I loaded the heavy box of envelopes into the passenger seat of my car. I drove down to the Gatlinburg post office, dodging the tourist traffic with a newfound sense of peace. When I handed the massive stack to the postal worker, a guy named Steve who looked chronically bored, he just raised an eyebrow. "Mass mailing?" Steve asked, weighing the stack. "Just sending out some invoices to my most valued customers," I said with a completely straight face. I walked out of the post office into the bright afternoon sun. The trap was officially sprung. The contract was executed. Now, all I had to do was wait for the Postal Service to deliver the consequences. The first few days were quiet. The system kept running, logging cars, flashing the strobe, and racking up new invoices every single day. I had to create a spreadsheet just to keep track of the sheer volume of customers entering the premium maneuvering zone. But I knew the storm was coming. The mail takes about 3 to 5 days to deliver. On Thursday morning, exactly 5 days after the first batch went out, my cell phone rang. I had set up a dedicated Google Voice number for the LLC and printed it at the bottom of the invoices, strictly for billing inquiries. I wanted them to have a way to contact me, mostly because I wanted to hear the panic in their voices. I answered it on the second ring, putting on my best, most professional customer service voice. Mountain View Premium Access, Billing Department. How can I direct your call? There was heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Then, a voice that sounded like it was vibrating with pure, unadulterated rage screamed into the receiver. "What in the actual hell is this?" It was Gary from Tampa, the Odyssey driver. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down and provide an invoice number so I can pull up your account," I said smoothly, opening my spreadsheet. "I have an invoice here for $200, Gary screamed, his voice cracking. "It says I owe you $200 for turning my car around in a driveway. This is extortion. This is a scam. I'm calling the police." "Sir, invoice 1001, correct?" I verified calmly. "I see your account right here. As the documentation clearly shows, you drove past a highly visible DOT-compliant commercial sign that established a unilateral contract. The fee for utilizing the facility is $200. You accepted the terms of the contract by passing the sign and utilizing the property. It is not a fine. It is a bill for services rendered." "Services rendered?" Gary shrieked. "It's a piece of pavement." "It is a highly maintained premium vehicular maneuvering zone," I corrected him. "And you utilized it at exactly 4:17 p.m. last Friday." "I am not paying this," Gary yelled. "You can't do this. I'll sue you. I'll have you arrested for mail fraud." "You are welcome to dispute the charge in civil court, Gary," I said, leaning back in my chair, enjoying this way more than I probably should have. "However, failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in late fees and the debt being sold to a collection agency, which will impact your credit score. We have photographic evidence of the contract and your vehicle entering the zone. The law is very clear on acceptance by conduct." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the phone. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Gary's head as he looked from the terrifyingly official invoice in his hand to the crystal-clear photo of his van driving past a sign that explicitly warned him of the fee. "This is ridiculous," he finally muttered, all the wind knocked out of his sails. "We accept all major credit cards, as well as cashier's checks," I said cheerfully. "Would you like me to send you the link to our secure payment portal?" He hung up on me. I smiled, marking his account in the spreadsheet as contacted, awaiting payment. But Gary was just the first drop in the bucket. Over the next 48 hours, the Google Voice number practically exploded. I fielded calls from angry soccer moms, furious rental car drivers, and one guy who claimed to be a lawyer who completely crumbled when I cited the specific case law, Parking I Lutted v. Beavis, a UK case, sure, but the principle of unilateral contract via signage is universally applicable in US civil courts, too. They yelled. They threatened. They called me every name in the book. But the conversation always ended the exact same way. I calmly referred them to the photographic evidence and the legally binding text of the sign. They realized they had no defense. They had willfully ignored a massive warning sign and used the property anyway. By the end of the second week, something miraculous happened. I walked out to my mailbox, which Chuck had generously repaired and reinforced with steel, and opened it. Inside were 5 envelopes addressed to Mountain View Premium Access LLC. I took them inside, sat at the kitchen island, and opened the first one. It was a personal check from a woman in Ohio for exactly $200. I opened the second one. A cashier's check for $200. The third, fourth, and fifth, all checks for $200. I sat there staring at $1,000 in clear, undisputed, legally obtained revenue. The trap didn't just work in theory. It was actually generating income. People were paying it because it was cheaper and easier than trying to fight an airtight civil contract in an out-of-state court. I literally started laughing out loud in my empty kitchen. I had monetized my own misery. I had turned a daily nightmare into an incredibly lucrative side hustle. But I knew this honeymoon phase wouldn't last forever. The out-of-state tourists were easy targets. They were scared of local laws and didn't want the hassle. The real test of this system was going to come from the locals. The people who lived in this town, who thought they owned the mountain, and who wouldn't be intimidated by a piece of paper in the mail. And sure enough, that afternoon, the real trouble started. I was sitting in the living room when I saw the red and blue flashing lights reflecting off the living room walls. I looked out the window. A Gatlinburg Police Department SUV was parked at the end of my driveway, right next to the massive yellow sign. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle and started walking up to my front door. They did not look happy. I guess it was time to find out just how legally bulletproof my little operation really was. I opened the front door before they even had a chance to knock. I mean, honestly, I had been preparing for this exact moment since the day I registered the LLC. I had a 2-inch, heavily tabbed, color-coded 3-ring binder sitting on my entryway table for specifically this occasion. I grabbed it and stepped out onto the porch. The 2 Gatlinburg patrol officers stopped at the bottom of the steps. The older one, whose name tag read Miller, looked like he was about 3 days away from retirement and deeply exhausted by the very concept of tourists. The younger one, Henderson, had his thumbs tucked into his duty belt and was giving me that hard, authoritative stare they teach you in the academy. "Morning, officers," I said cheerfully, leaning against the porch railing, holding my binder like a shield. "Beautiful day to protect and serve, isn't it?" Officer Henderson didn't smile. "Sir, we've received multiple complaints this morning regarding this address. We have people claiming you're running a fraudulent ticketing scheme, impersonating a municipality, and committing localized extortion." "Extortion is a very strong word, Officer Henderson," I said, opening my binder to the first perfectly laminated tab. "And impersonating a municipality is factually incorrect, considering my signage explicitly states it is private commercial property. Sir, you can't mail people $200 traffic tickets for using a driveway," Henderson said, taking a step up the stairs, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "Only the police department and the city can issue traffic citations." "I totally agree," I said, nodding vigorously. "Which is why I'm not issuing traffic citations. I am issuing corporate invoices for services rendered under a unilateral contract." I walked down the steps and handed the binder to Officer Miller, who looked at it like I had just handed him a live grenade. "Tab 1, I instructed, pointing to the binder. "That is my official Sevier County business license, doing business as Mountain View Premium Access LLC. It's fully paid, stamped, and authorized by the county clerk. Tab 2 is the zoning overlay showing that while this is a residential address, there are no municipal ordinances preventing the operation of a commercial toll facility on private property." Miller squinted at the paperwork. Henderson looked annoyed. "A toll facility?" Henderson scoffed. "You don't have a toll booth. I operate an automated high-speed toll gateway, much like the EZ Pass lanes on the interstate." I corrected him smoothly. "If you look at tab 3, you'll see the Department of Transportation compliance regulations for commercial signage. My sign, the massive diamond-grade reflective yellow one at the end of the asphalt right there, exceeds all state requirements for visibility and legibility." "Listen, buddy," Henderson started, his face getting a little red. "People are calling 911 saying you're scamming them." "They aren't being scammed, they're being billed," I interrupted. "They are willingly entering into a contract. Let me ask you this, Officer Henderson. If I open a private parking lot downtown, put up a sign that says parking $50 a day, and a guy parks there, does he owe me $50? "Well, yeah," Henderson admitted, frowning. "But that's parking. What's the legal difference between a private parking lot and a private maneuvering zone?" I asked, leaning in. Both are privately owned, paved surfaces offering a vehicular convenience in exchange for a posted fee. The legal mechanism is identical. It's called acceptance by conduct. Miller was actually reading the paperwork now. He flipped to tab 4, which contained a printed copy of the invoice I was mailing out, complete with the legal boilerplate. "You're using LPR cameras?" Miller asked, looking up at the heavy-duty rigs Chuck had installed on the steel pole. "Commercial grade," I confirmed proudly. "Infrared, motion-triggered, with a DOT-compliant LED strobe relay. It logs the plate, timestamp, and provides high-definition photographic evidence of the vehicle passing the terms of service." Just as I said that, as if the universe was actively endorsing my malicious compliance, a silver Hyundai Elantra with New York plates came creeping down the street. We all stopped talking and turned to watch. The Elantra pulled up to my driveway. It paused. The driver leaned forward, clearly reading the massive yellow sign. You could see the internal debate happening in real time. They were lost. The GPS was yelling at them. The road ahead looked terrifyingly narrow, and they just wanted to turn around. They assumed the sign was a bluff. The Elantra rolled forward over the property line. Flash! Flash! The strobe fired off in the broad daylight, bouncing aggressively off the Hyundai's windshield. The driver slammed on the brakes, looking terrified, threw it in reverse, and backed out so fast the front bumper scraped the asphalt. They sped off toward the parkway. I looked at the cops. "That," I said, pointing at the empty driveway, "was a legally binding agreement. I will pull their registration via my commercial skip tracing account, and they will receive an invoice for $200 by next Thursday." Officer Miller slowly closed the binder and handed it back to me. A massive, barely concealed grin was spreading across his weathered face. He looked at Henderson. "He's got a business license, kid," Miller said to his partner, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "And he's got the signage. This ain't criminal. It's a civil matter." "But Sarge is going to want to know why we aren't shutting him down," Henderson argued, clearly not wanting to lose the argument to a guy standing on a porch in plaid boxers and a t-shirt. "So call Sarge," Miller said, pulling his radio off his shoulder. He keyed the mic. "Dispatch, Unit 4. Can you get Sergeant Higgins on the line for a supervisor consult at the Mountain View address?" A few seconds later, the radio crackled. "Go ahead, Miller. This is Higgins." "Yeah, Sarge," Miller said, leaning against his patrol SUV. "We're out here with the homeowner. He's got a registered LLC, commercial signage clearly posting a fee for entering the property, and an automated camera system. He's not issuing citations, he's issuing corporate invoices for breach of a unilateral contract. It's entirely civil." There was a long pause on the radio. The static hissed. I could literally hear the gears turning in the sergeant's head all the way at the precinct. "You're telling me," Sergeant Higgins finally replied, his voice dripping with tired disbelief, "that this guy legally turned his own driveway into a $200 toll road just to spite the tourists?" "That is exactly what I'm telling you, Sarge," Miller said, grinning. Another pause. "Tell the homeowner I think he's a petty maniac, but he's not breaking any criminal statutes. Clear the scene. If anyone else calls 911 about it, dispatch will advise them it's a civil dispute and to contact a lawyer." "Copy that, Sarge. Unit 4 clearing." Miller clipped the radio back to his shoulder and looked at me. "You are an absolute menace to society, sir." "I am simply participating in the free market economy, Officer Miller," I replied, holding my binder tight against my chest. "Have a good day," Miller laughed, getting into the SUV. Henderson gave me one last, intensely frustrated glare before climbing into the passenger seat. As they backed out of the street, Miller gave me a quick tap of the siren, a little chirp of respect, before driving away. I walked back inside, feeling like I had just conquered Mount Everest. The police had officially validated the trap. The local government recognized it as a civil matter. I was untouchable. The tourists were totally at my mercy, and the checks were rolling in. But I had forgotten the golden rule of living in a mountain tourist town. The tourists are annoying, sure. But the locals? The wealthy, entitled, out-of-state locals who buy million-dollar cabins and think they own the entire county? They are a completely different breed of nightmare. Enter Brad. Honestly, I don't even know what Brad did for a living, but he looked like the kind of guy who sold cryptocurrency to elderly people. He drove a pristine, matte black Mercedes G-Wagon that looked like it had never even seen a puddle, let alone an unpaved mountain road. He owned a massive monstrosity of a cabin about a mile up the mountain behind my house. Because of the weird, winding layout of the roads, if Brad drove down the mountain and saw that the parkway was jammed with traffic, the fastest way for him to abort his trip and go back home was to bang a hard left, pull into my driveway, execute a wildly aggressive three-point turn, and speed back up the hill. He did it all the time before the sign went up. I hated it. His G-Wagon had these absurdly bright aftermarket headlights that shone directly into my living room windows every single evening. I figured the massive yellow sign would stop him. It stopped almost everyone else who had a shred of reading comprehension. But Brad was built different. Brad operated on a level of entitlement that defied human logic. The first time he hit the trap was a Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my computer processing the day's invoices when the software chimed. Ding! I looked at the screen. The matte black G-Wagon was rolling right past the sign. The strobe flashed. Flash, flash, lighting up his windshield. The camera caught a crystal-clear image of Brad. He was wearing mirrored aviators at dusk, talking on his cell phone, and holding a green juice. He didn't flinch at the strobe. He didn't even look at the sign. He just whipped the massive SUV around, his tires squealing on my asphalt, and rocketed back up the mountain. "All right, Brad," I muttered, pulling up his plate in the skip tracing software. "Let's see how much that green juice actually cost you." I printed the invoice, stuffed it in an envelope, and mailed it to the massive multi-million-dollar cabin address listed on his registration. I expected a phone call. I expected an angry voicemail. I got nothing. 3 days later, the trap went off again. Ding, flash, flash. It was Brad, again, in the G-Wagon, doing the exact same turnaround, completely ignoring the sign. I printed a second invoice, mailed it. The next day, he did it again. And then he did it twice on a Saturday. By the end of the month, Brad had triggered the LPR cameras exactly 20 times. He was using my driveway as his personal daily roundabout. I was dutifully printing the invoices, stacking the late fees according to the terms clearly laid out in the mailed documents, and sending them certified mail so I had proof of delivery. He was signing for them. He was receiving them. And he was completely, utterly ignoring them. My spreadsheet was getting top-heavy. Brad's account balance sat at a staggering $4,000 in principal fees, not including the compounding late penalties. Dave, my neighbor, thought it was hilarious. We were leaning on the fence one afternoon when the G-Wagon went roaring past us up the mountain. "He's playing chicken with you, kid," Dave said, chewing on his unlit cigar. "He thinks because he's got money, your little paper bills don't mean squat. He knows you ain't the government. He thinks you won't actually do anything about it." "He owes me $4,000, Dave," I said, watching the black SUV disappear around a bend. "I'm not playing chicken. I'm building a paper trail." But the sheer disrespect was starting to get under my skin. The tourists were ignorant. They didn't know any better. Brad knew exactly what he was doing. He was doing it out of pure, unadulterated spite. He wanted to prove that my rules didn't apply to him. The showdown happened on a Tuesday morning. I was walking down the driveway in my slippers to check the reinforced mailbox. The Gatlinburg air was crisp, the sky was clear, and my blood pressure was relatively stable. Until I heard the low, aggressive rumble of a V8 engine. I looked up. The black G-Wagon was coming down the street. Brad saw the traffic backed up at the stop sign a quarter-mile down. He didn't even hesitate. He cranked the wheel and accelerated directly toward my driveway. I was standing right in the middle of the asphalt. I didn't move. I just stood there, holding a fistful of junk mail, staring him down. Brad slammed on the massive ceramic brakes. The G-Wagon lurched to a halt exactly 3 feet from my knees, the front bumper hovering right over the property line, inches from the massive yellow sign. We stared at each other through his pristine windshield. He hit a button, and the heavily tinted driver's side window rolled down with a smooth, expensive hum. Brad leaned out. He was wearing a ridiculously tight polo shirt and a Rolex that cost more than my first house. He looked at me with an expression of pure, concentrated disdain. "Move," he commanded. Not a request. A directive. "Good morning, Brad," I said, taking a sip from my coffee mug. "I see you're enjoying the premium vehicular maneuvering zone. Your current account balance is $4,250, including late fees. Will you be settling that with a check today, or do you prefer wire transfer?" Brad let out a harsh, barking laugh. It was the sound of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "You really think your little fake traffic tickets mean anything to me?" he sneered, resting his arm on the door. "You're a clown playing make-believe. I wipe my ass with your little invoices, buddy. Now get out of my way before I run you over." "It's a legally binding unilateral contract," I replied calmly, pointing up at the sign towering above us. "It explicitly states the terms. You have been documented willfully violating those terms 20 times. The law, specifically the legal doctrine of quantum meruit, states that if you utilize a service with a clearly posted fee, you owe the fee, regardless of whether you formally agreed to it in writing. Acceptance by conduct, Brad." Brad rolled his eyes so hard I thought he might detach a retina. "Listen to me, you pathetic little rent-a-cop," Brad spat, his face flushing with anger. "I live up the hill. I drive where I want, when I want. You put a piece of plastic in your yard and think you're the law. You're nothing. Take me to court, loser, I dare you. My lawyers will bury you so deep you won't see daylight for a decade." He revved the engine. It was a loud, threatening roar. I took a slow step to the left, stepping off the asphalt and onto the grass. "Okay, Brad," I said softly, giving him a polite little nod. "I really was hoping you'd say that." Brad sneered, slammed the SUV into gear, and blew past me. "Flash! Flash!" The strobe caught him perfectly. He whipped around the driveway, tearing up a small patch of grass near the oak tree, and sped back out onto the street, flipping me off out the window as he drove away. I stood there, watching him go. My hands were shaking a little bit. But not from fear. It was the adrenaline of pure, absolute, malicious intent. I didn't even go back inside for my keys. I walked straight to my car, got in, and drove directly to the Sevier County Courthouse. I walked up to the clerk's window. Brenda was sitting there, typing away on her keyboard, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "Well, if it isn't the toll booth king," Brenda said, looking up over her frames. "What can I do for you today, sweetheart? You registering another driveway?" "No, Brenda," I said, pulling a massive stack of papers out of my bag and sliding them under the glass partition. "I need to file a civil suit for breach of contract, and I need a summons issued." Brenda looked at the stack. She flipped through the first few pages. It was a masterpiece of legal documentation. I had included the LLC registration, the DOT compliance specs for the sign, the printed case law establishing precedents for unilateral contracts, and a chronological, color-coded spreadsheet of every single time Brad's G-Wagon had entered the property. Behind the spreadsheet were 20 individual high-definition photographs. Each one showed the G-Wagon passing the glowing yellow sign. Each one clearly showed Brad's license plate. Each one had a digital, indisputable timestamp. And at the very back were the certified mail receipts, proving that Brad had received and signed for every single invoice I had sent him. Brenda let out a low whistle. "Ooh-wee. You ain't playing around, are you?" He told me to take him to court, Brenda, I said with a deadpan expression. I am simply honoring my client's request. Defendant's name? She asked, pulling up a fresh form on her computer. Bradford, I said, reading off the skip tracing report. He owes $4,250 in unpaid service fees, plus I'll be seeking filing fees, process server fees, and court costs. Brenda typed furiously for a minute. The heavy industrial printer behind her whirred to life and spit out a thick, official-looking document with a blue county seal stamped on the front. All right, sugar, Brenda said, sliding the document back under the glass. Court date is set for the 14th of next month at 9 a.m., courtroom B, before Judge Harrison. You'll need to hire a process server to hit him with the papers. Way ahead of you, I said, tapping the glass. Thank you, Brenda. I left the courthouse and drove straight to a local private investigation firm that handled process serving. I paid a guy named Mike $75 to drive up the mountain and hand-deliver the lawsuit to Brad. I told Mike to make sure he caught Brad when he was getting into his G-Wagon. I wanted it to be poetic. That evening, I was sitting on my porch with Dave, drinking a beer, when my cell phone buzzed. It was a text from Mike, the process server. Target served at 6:15 p.m. He threw the papers on the ground and screamed profanities. Good luck in court, buddy. I showed the text to Dave. Dave took a long pull from his beer, looked at the glowing yellow sign at the end of the driveway, and started chuckling. The chuckle turned into a wheeze, and the wheeze turned into a full-blown belly laugh. You really did it, Dave wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. You actually sued the richest, most entitled jerk on the mountain over a driveway turnaround. I didn't sue him over a turnaround, Dave, I said, clinking my beer bottle against his. I sued him for breach of contract. There is a very distinct legal difference. The next 3 weeks were agonizingly slow. I spent every night reviewing my notes, memorizing the case law, and organizing my binder until it was an impenetrable fortress of logic and evidence. I knew Brad was going to come in hot. He was probably going to bring some high-priced corporate lawyer in a custom suit who would try to bury me in legal jargon and procedural objections. I was going pro se, representing myself. I didn't need a lawyer. I had the facts, I had the photographic evidence, and I had a sign that was legally flawless. Finally, the 14th rolled around. I woke up at 6 a.m., ironed my only decent suit, and packed my binder into a leather briefcase. I drank 2 cups of black coffee, staring out the window at my driveway. The trap had caught 3 more tourists the night before, but I didn't even care. Today was about Brad. Today was about the final boss. I drove to the Sevier County Courthouse, walked through the metal detectors, and found my way to courtroom B. It was a standard, slightly depressing municipal courtroom. Wooden benches, a heavy oak table for the plaintiff and defendant, and a raised bench for the judge, flanked by the Tennessee state flag. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, opened my briefcase, and meticulously laid out my binder, my high-res photos, and my printed statutes. I made sure the tabs were perfectly aligned. At exactly 8:55 a.m., the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Brad walked in. He was wearing a tailored navy suit with a pocket square, looking like he had just stepped off a yacht. But what immediately caught my attention was who was not with him. He was alone. He hadn't brought a lawyer. He swaggered down the aisle, completely ignoring me, and dropped his briefcase onto the defendant's table with a loud thud. He sat down, leaned back in his chair, and crossed his arms, looking bored. He was representing himself. He genuinely thought this case was so beneath him, such an absolute joke, that he could just walk in, tell the judge I was a lunatic, and get the case dismissed on sheer arrogance alone. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "All rise," the bailiff barked as the door behind the bench opened. Judge Harrison walked in. He was an older man with a severe haircut and a no-nonsense demeanor. He looked like a guy who had spent 30 years listening to people lie about property lines and zoning disputes, and he was absolutely sick of it. He sat down, adjusted his microphone, and opened the massive file folder on his desk. "All right," Judge Harrison grumbled, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "First item on the docket, case number 24 CV1092, Mountain View Premium Access LLC versus Bradford." The judge paused, squinting at the paperwork. "This is a civil claim for unpaid contractual service fees?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, standing up promptly. "And the defendant is representing himself?" the judge asked, looking over his glasses at Brad. "I am, Your Honor," Brad said smoothly, standing up and giving the judge a confident smile. "Because this entire proceeding is a frivolous waste of the court's time. This man is trying to extort me for driving on a piece of pavement." Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Bradford, this court determines what is and is not a waste of time. Let's proceed."